Civil liberties and civil rights. This is part two in our discussion of what these are and what do they have to do with the role of the people. So we've already learned that there are guaranteed protections for American citizens in the Constitution. Civil liberties are specifically mentioned or implied, as some Supreme Court justices have ruled, in the Bill of Rights. So, for example, you have a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures of your home and property. You have a right to an attorney. You have a right to have the Army not in your basement eating all your food. And you know the first 10 amendments. But civil rights are a little different. And in this talk, we're going to cover it a little bit more. We've already covered it, I think, in other discussions. But we're going to look at it a little bit differently because it does really fall within the role of the people. Civil rights really is the action of a government to create equal conditions for Americans. So in other words, you have a right to be treated equally. And when you're not, you can count on your government to make it happen. And this is usually associated with minority groups and women, but it's everyone. Everyone has a right to be treated equally by their government. So civil, when we hear civil, it means like in our own country, by our own government and its people. So I want you to think about how someone is treated and the right to be treated equally. That's connected to civil rights, whereas liberties are more about your personal freedoms that you have. So civil rights, as we go down this road, I want you to think about a couple of things that relate to civil rights in terms of legal process. Because one of the big parts of American history has been that the federal government or state government or local government has treated people unequally based on what they look like or their race or their gender. And ideally, you're supposed to be treated equally. So when you're not treated equally, then that becomes a civil rights matter. And oftentimes people of color or women would be singled out, and when they are in trouble with the law or the government, they would be treated differently than someone who was perhaps, say, white or who had a lot of money. So we have to kind of deal with a couple legal issues here. Due process. Due process is the requirement that you should be treated equally by clear and open established rules and principles, right? So if you happen to be arrested, then you're told your rights, you have a speedy trial, you have a right to an attorney, that a trial is open, that people could come and hear what's happening and watch what's happening. You can be found innocent or guilty by a jury of your peers. All of that is established, and everybody knows those are the procedures that's going to happen to ensure that everybody is treated equally and everyone is given due process of law. Now this applies to civil matters, which in this case civil means like if you're suing someone, but criminal as well. So due process of law is part of our Constitution. It's part of the Fifth Amendment originally, and later it was given a little more power with the 14th Amendment. So here's a question you should think about. In the Constitution, in the Fifth Amendment, it talks about how we all have life, liberty, and property, which comes from the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's all this kind of thinking that in America you have these rights. But can the government take away these rights? I say it again, I'll just let you ponder it. You have the right to life, liberty, and property. Can the government take these away? Well, the answer is yes, but not without due process of law. All right, so can the government take your property? Yes, if you don't pay taxes, but they just can't show up and take it. They have to follow a process. You have to go to court, you're given certain rights, you have a chance to defend yourself. But in the end, if the jury finds that you didn't pay your taxes, then yes, the government can take your property. Same thing with liberty. There are tons of people in prisons right now who the government has taken their liberty. They can't just do whatever they want, but they can't take the liberty of a citizen without due process of law. And in extreme cases, people have been put to death on death row, but hopefully not without the due process of law, meaning that everybody knows what's going to happen and the government follows the process. And here's the part that falls within civil rights, is everyone was treated equally, and that hasn't always been the case. So the Fifth Amendment, there are a lot of words here. We already know this amendment, right? The right to remain silent, and you have the right to not to be tried twice for the same crime. But the second part down that's bolded, no citizen shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So that's just making sure that everyone knows the federal government can't put you in jail without following the process. But this really only dealt with the federal government. So what about all those states that were depriving people of life, liberty, and property without the due process of law? What about those states that were maybe treating people of color or women harshly, more harshly than they would people who had, say, money or who were white? This amendment really did not focus on the states. And so, when the Civil War came along and the South was broken, that's when the federal government decided this is our chance to act. Once they had beaten the Confederacy, the government passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment, you remember, 1-3, no slavery, so no more slavery in America. The 14th Amendment said that everybody will be treated equally, and they added this in the 14th Amendment, that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And we're going to treat everyone equally, equal protection of the laws. All right, so this was not a very popular amendment, obviously, in the South, but what are they going to do about it? They had been beaten, and they have to accept it. And of course, the 15th Amendment says that African American men can vote. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment really now is going to try to ensure that people in America are going to be treated better. Obviously, no slavery. You want to treat everyone equally, and the men can vote. African American men. Now, what does this 14th Amendment deal with civil rights, or how does it deal with civil rights? The question really is, does it allow the federal governments to deal with the states that discriminate? So all across the South, when the 14th Amendment was passed, states began to pass rules about keeping the two groups, in this case mostly people of color and whites, separated. And we would call this segregation. So whether we're talking about Georgia or Alabama or Tennessee, states passed laws, we call them Jim Crow laws, that separated the two groups. And the real question right after the Civil War for a couple decades was, do these new laws that are passed by the state of Georgia or whatever southern state we're talking about, separating the two races, does that violate the 14th Amendment? Now, that's a question that you and I obviously know the answer to now, but at the time it was really one of those, we don't know, I don't know, this is crazy. It was a crazy time. So they, of course, the people of the country, looked to the Supreme Court for guidance on this. So in 1896, the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case, Supreme Court of the United States rules that this kind of separate but equal doctrine is allowed. So even though the 14th Amendment says we're going to treat everyone equally, when states do what we see on the screen here, provide a drinking fountain for white people and a drinking fountain for people of color, the Supreme Court said that's fine. That does not violate the 14th Amendment. And so basically it was a green light to half of the country to go ahead and you can do this kind of stuff. You want to have separate universities, separate public schools, separate places to eat, separate places to ride on the bus, go ahead, because that separate but equal does not violate the 14th Amendment, which says you're going to treat everybody equally. And it does not violate the Equal Protection Clause and Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, what was clear is that there were a lot of people who were arrested, people of color, for example, in the South, who were arrested and not treated equally and were not given due process of law. They might have been found guilty quickly. They might not have been given an attorney. There's just so many instances of southern states not following the due process and equal protection part. And maybe these southern states felt empowered that they could do that thanks to the Supreme Court case in 1896. So from 1896 until the 1950s, that's the way it was in the South. If you were a person of color, you probably were segregated. Maybe you lived in fear. You did not have the same existence in America, you did not have the same rights in America as someone who was white. In 1954, a new Supreme Court decides to take this issue up again. And this time they're looking at the public schools in Kansas. In Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, SCOTUS strikes down the separate but equal doctrine that had been established. And they say to the country, everyone must change. Everybody's got to integrate. The federal government, state government, everybody now has to follow this rule, which is we cannot separate anymore. It's inherently unequal because the drinking fountain for people of color was a yucky one. The people who could use the white one, they got the better one. This is not right. And so they order the country to change. And of course, it's going to cause a lot of people in the South to be super angry and a lot of tension. And the 1950s and 60s are going to be very, very turbulent for America. So civil rights means, according now to the Supreme Court in 1954, that everybody's going to be treated equally. It can't be a separate this and a separate that for anybody. All of us are going to be treated equally, regardless of our race, our gender, our disability, in every part of American society that the government has a say in. So there are a lot of people who will rise up. Average citizens, people, will rise up and push for these changes. Okay, when you look at this logo, these aren't senators or governors. These are just people who realize that their country was not living up to the ideals that it was founded upon. And so they push for their rights, meaning their civil rights, to be treated equally. And obviously it's going to be violent. There's going to be a lot of people in the South who resist, who will kill civil rights leaders. It's just a very difficult time. But they don't stop and they keep pushing to be treated equally. So this is in the terms of what the government can do. Like the government has to treat everyone equally. The state of Alabama has to treat everyone equally. A person of color can come to the University of Alabama the same way that a white student can. But what about like businesses? If I own like a little restaurant, can I somehow not serve people of color? Well, the government passes in 1964, thanks to a lot of the work of people like Martin Luther King, who you can see in the middle there, and President Lyndon Johnson and others, a Civil Rights Act, a law of Congress that says discrimination in public businesses now is also prohibited. So the Supreme Court says we have to integrate the government of America, you can't discriminate. And now this new law says if you're a business, even a private little restaurant in the middle of nowhere in Alabama, you serve everyone. You can't discriminate, treat everyone equally, race, color, religion, national origin. So civil rights is a struggle, and it continues to be a struggle for many to be treated equally by the government. But why do I bring this up now? Why is this part of this module? Because if we think about great civil rights leaders, people who pushed for America to be better, to treat everyone equally, they are many times just ordinary people. This is Martin Luther King Jr. He's a pastor. He just felt that things were wrong. Many people who became civil rights leaders were just people who knew their role, and they saw that their government was not doing what it should do, had strayed from the founding principles. They acted. So here's a couple big questions for you to wrestle with that really fall within this whole module. Are minority groups at risk in a republic where the majority rules? Is it possible for the majority to just pass rules to discriminate? Yes, it is possible. So minority groups have to be on guard. We hope we have enough safeguards in the Constitution to protect. But again, the Constitution can be changed by a supermajority. So think about that. What role do the people play in protecting civil liberties and civil rights? Hopefully you've thought about that. And who should you rely on for knowing and protecting civil liberties and civil rights? Should you know them? Wrestle with this. Ponder it. Become a great American citizen.